want to get some more perspective on the nature of the guilty counts and sort of the legalities of what Trump is facing and will continue to face now from Renato Mariotti. He's a former U.S. federal prosecutor. Mr. Mariotti, pleasure to welcome you to the show. Thanks for making the time.
Happy to be here.
I imagine you followed this trial as it progressed. Any surprise on your part that the jury did find Mr. Trump guilty on all 34 counts?
No surprise whatsoever. I would have been surprised if you told me this before the trial started. Before the trial started, I think there was a very significant opportunity for Trump and his team to score a victory in this case. It was a very winnable case. But ultimately, what Trump's team did was they really adopted a strategy that was Trumpian in a way. They contested everything. They attacked everyone. And as a result, they, I think, lost credibility with the jury and ultimately did not focus the jury on the weaknesses in the prosecution's case.
In layman's terms, what's the easiest way to understand the nature of the charges Trump faced? Because I know everyone called it a hush money trial, but it wasn't really about the hush money itself.
That's right. I mean, Trump was charged with falsifying business records, okay? So the hush money payments that we're talking about is essentially money was going to an adult actress that Trump had an encounter with. Whether that was a sexual encounter or not was irrelevant, although that became a big fight of contention at the trial. But the bottom line was that money was being paid. And that money that was paid ultimately from a lawyer to that woman, and ultimately from the Trump organization to that lawyer, it was recorded in the records of Trump's company, the Trump organization, as payment for legal services, which it was not. Those are false entries in business records. That was what the crime was. And the allegation is that those payments were being made to conceal a campaign finance crime.
And why did the prosecutor pursue this as a felony charge versus a misdemeanor? And what's the difference?
Well, one reason is because the misdemeanor charges had lapsed. They went past the statute of limitations, for one thing. And the difference between a misdemeanor and a felony is that in the United States, a felony is a crime that's punishable by over 1 year in prison. A misdemeanor is a lesser offense that is punishable by up to 1 year in prison. And so given that the statute of limitations on the misdemeanors lapsed, this was proceeded as a felony. And Trump's team had the opportunity to ask the judge to give an instruction to the jury that they could have found him guilty of a misdemeanor in lieu of a felony, and they chose not to do so.
We're talking to Renato Mariotti, former U.S. federal prosecutor, about the guilty verdict just handed down to former President Donald Trump. When it comes to the way in which the defense handled this case, where do you think they went wrong?
So the weakness of the prosecution's case was really regarding these false statements in business records. At the end of the day, those false statements regarding the payments for legal services were made when Trump was already president of the United States in 2017. The defense could have focused the jury on the relative lack of evidence that Trump actually knew about the false statements and directed that those false statements be made in the books of records of the Trump organization. But to do that, the defense would have needed to focus their energy on that very narrow, specific point, rather than fighting about whether or not Trump actually had sex with a porn star at a hotel room, whether or not, for example, the payments themselves that were made from the lawyer were hush money payments, whether or not the payments were actually payments for legal services. They contested all of these issues and attacked on all of these points. And so, of course, because there's a lot of very substantial evidence as to those other points, they ended up sort of losing the jury and their credibility with the jury as a result.
There were a number of questions, particularly when Michael Cohen, Trump's former fixer and close ally turned bitter enemy, started testifying around his credibility, right? And if the prosecution could sort of bank on his testimony as being convincing in any way to the jury, how do you think they were able to surmount those challenges?
So on many, many points, Michael Cohen was backed up by other documents and evidence. There were email communications, text messages, documents, and so forth. The checks that Trump signed that mentioned that the payments, of course, were to Michael Cohen. All of those documents, evidence, there was actually a recording, all of that corroborated Michael Cohen's testimony. Now, the defense could have pointed out that as to very certain narrow points, like the narrow point I mentioned earlier, Cohen was essentially out on his own. There was no corroboration. But the defense didn't do that. They spent over a day detailing every lie that Cohen ever told, and focusing kind of on an attack on every single point that Cohen made. And as a result, the prosecution could rightly point out that 99 times out of 100, they had a document or an email or the testimony of someone else that backed up Cohen.
Just one final question for you, Mr. Mariotti, before I let you go, and it's around the sentencing. It's going to happen July 11th. The judge has already determined the date for that. I'm no legal expert. I've just read everything I could, and there seems to be some consensus that he likely won't go to jail, though the possibility exists. Do you think that's a fair assessment, and what might inform that conclusion?
I do think that's a fair assessment, because most defendants who are found guilty of this specific charge in Manhattan are not sentenced to a term of imprisonment. And given the circumstances, I don't think that the judge is going to impose a particularly harsh sentence here, given the implications it could have on the ongoing election and on the country at large.
Okay, Mr. Mariotti, I want to thank you very much for your insights tonight. Thank you.